I'm here with Julie McMaster, the Toledo Museum of Art's archivist. And Julie, can you tell everyone what an archivist does?
I'm an institutional archivist as opposed to a special collections archivist. So my job is to preserve the historical memory of the institution. And we do that by gathering pieces of history along the time frame of the history of the institution. So an archivist collects not just papers, but video, electronic records, objects, kind of anything that really can state the history of the organization.
So talk a little bit about some of the videos that you've collected. For example, I think a lot of people probably think of archives as sort of dusty folders full of paper, but I've seen some remarkable videos, some that you've created recently and some that speak to the institution's history. So tell us a little bit about the oldest video that we have and the newest video that we have.
So the oldest video that I know of is probably scanning across the front of the building in 1912. So it was during that inaugural point of view or time period. So about 1912, there's a scan across the front of the building, and you can tell there's no wings, and you can tell by the foliage, at least I can tell by the foliage, and from comparing it to other pictures, that it was one of the earliest things that we have. For the most recent, we will be collecting things such as this interview, but we also do oral history interviews with contemporary people. We want to talk to the people who have been living today through and to capture their memories of their interactions with this institution, because 50 years from now, I don't want to say, or my successor to say, why didn't they talk to such and such, because they would have had a great point of view. So from 1912 until literally present day.
That's amazing. And I remember seeing a video, and it obviously isn't the earliest, but I remember seeing a video that we have of Edward Drummond Libby playing with his nieces, maybe?
Yes.
Yeah.
That is a little bit later than the 1912 one.
Yeah.
But it is Edward Drummond Libby, and I think they're in New Hampshire at a resort, and he's playing with his two nieces, Marjorie and Margaret. I can't remember the other one's name.
You could say almost anything, and everyone watching this will agree. You're the expert here.
But they are little girls, and they're running around him, and he has this wonderful hat, and he has a cigar in his mouth, and he's obviously enjoying spending time with his actually great nieces. Wow. So yeah, it's the only motion picture that I know of Edward Drummond Libby. And if anyone knows of some others, please let me know, because it really, and it came from the family. So these were his great nieces. So his sister Alice Walbridge, it was her grandchildren, and it was the grandchildren of the older of the two girls that I got that film from.
Well, I mean, the reason it was so impactful to me in my first tenure here seeing it was it humanized this individual who was so important, of course, to our narrative and so important to Toledo's history, but is this abstract figure in so many ways. And here he was, not just moving, but you really got a sense for his humanity. And I think this is the beauty of archives in general, and of the historical research and the institutional record keeping that you do, is it provides the context and the texture for the decision making that the museum has undertaken, for the important people in our history, and why the oral history project you're undertaking is so great. So let me ask, how long have you been the archivist?
I have been the archivist for 26 years.
And have you been the archivist solely, or have you worn other hats as well?
I have worn lots of different hats here.
Tell everyone some of the hats you've worn.
Okay, so I have worked in the technology area for quite some time, and I started here as the archivist. And most of my early work was done in preparation for our centennial year, which was in 2001. We did lots of activities for that celebration, including exhibitions, publication. We did a documentary with WGTE. We partnered with them. I worked with the Toledo Designs exhibition that we had. So there were lots of things that were going on in a very short period of time. So then after the centennial was over and things died down, they kind of were like, what do we do with her? And somebody figured out that I was fairly good with computers and data. And so I was put on a group that was tasked with making electronic records out of our collection records. So we chose software. We went through that whole system of doing that and then adding records. And then we decided that we didn't like that software and we just chose a different software. And it was my job to then morph things from one software to another. And then that slowly became more and more technology driven, and suddenly I became a full-fledged technology person. And sometimes I scratch my head and go, I don't know how that happened because my passion is really in history. I can do technology projects, I can manage them, but managing them is usually for me calling somebody who really knows what they're doing and having them come in and do it. So I am back in the place where I should be.
Well, so you're to that end, you are our full-time archivist yet again.
Yes.
Right, and we're so thrilled to have you in that position. So you've already mentioned a few times in that role as sort of the custodian of our history. You've mentioned the longevity of that history. You've alluded to a video from 1912 to our centennial in 2001. So one of the implications is that this museum has been around since 1901.
That's right.
And certainly as I have come in and thinking about the lessons I can learn from other people, but also the lessons I can learn from history, it has been instructive to remember that this is not the first global pandemic that this museum has faced. So could you tell me and tell everyone a little bit about how the museum weathered the Spanish flu in 1918 into 1919 and what that looked like for the Toledo Museum of Art?
I did do some research into this because it was so timely because of what we are going through right now. And I was amazed as I was looking through the newspaper clippings at the similarities and the differences between, of course there will be differences between how things happened in 1918 and in 2020, but in 1918 one of the things that struck me was how decentralized the administration of quarantine was. So pretty much everyone is understanding that the governors are the ones who decide that they're going to have shutdown orders, that all restaurants are shut down and so forth. But in 1918, there was a delay in Columbus. They decided to recommend that things would be shut down. And it was several days later before the mayor of Toledo heard it and started to shut things down here. So it was October 14th when the museum actually shut down. It was a Thursday, and it was at the same time as saloons and pool houses and theaters and movie theaters, and there was a distinction between the two apparently.
Right.
And you weren't able to have funerals, and you shouldn't go to church, and all of these things. Libraries were closed, and libraries and the museum were kind of lumped together. And so they did close all of the things down, but one of the differences in 1918 was what Governor DeWine was talking about that we wanted to prevent was the large spike of people and then having an overwhelming amount of people that needed to be cared for. Well, that's exactly what happened in 1918. What we were trying to prevent and did hopefully successfully prevent happened. So within 5 days, it went from 3 people having it to 300. And then on, it just curved way up. And by the end of the pandemic, or the epidemic as they called it then, just in the city of Toledo, not even all of Lucas County, just the city of Toledo, there were over 700 people who died.
Wow.
And over the months and months of people, I just looked at the stats this morning, and 293 people have died from COVID-19 in all of Lucas County. So it's a much different scenario, and you have to understand that there weren't vaccines that were effective. We don't have a vaccine yet, but eventually we will. There was no penicillin. There were no ventilators. The way that they approached this was they wanted everything to be opened up and ventilated. So we're talking about Northwest Ohio in October and November, and everything had to be opened up. So the streetcars, all the windows were open. In your houses, in order to prevent the contagion from hitting you, you had every window open. So if you think that you were already sick, and then to have it be, I don't know if it was cold, I don't know if it's warm October, but to think that all of your windows in your house had to be open and you were already ill, that probably contributed to...
Probably was cold.
Yes, it was probably pretty cold and may have contributed to some of the deaths for people who are already sick.
Well, it's funny. Nothing about this is humorous, right? But there's this expression: the more things change, the more they stay the same. So on the one hand, there are substantial differences, and on the other, it remains CDC guidelines to open windows when you clean. So we've made tremendous advances in public health, of course, and in medical technology, and in life sciences in general. But so while we have these differences, there are also these similarities, and it begs the question: what lessons do you think there are for the Toledo Museum of Art to learn as we move towards reopening, given our experiences in 1918?
Well, one of the problems is that we don't have a lot of information about what specifically the museum did. I know when they closed, I know when they opened back up. And then I also know that when they opened back up, there was a second wave that hit Toledo, and in late November, early December, and it was hitting the schools and school children. So the schools closed again. And they wanted to keep children and adults separated. So for the first time since George Stevens in 1903 became the director of the museum, they actually didn't openly welcome children to come to the museum. They had separate things for the children to do. The only activities were movies, but it was only children that went to the movies. Children weren't coming to the concerts and to the tours and things like that. That was, they separated the two. But eventually that stopped, and everyone embraced each other as the pandemic, as the epidemic went away. And what can we learn? We can learn that although things seem so different right now, that next normal will establish itself, and we will in time understand how to deal with things with the situation that we have. There might be more cleaning that happens. There might be, we might be a little bit more careful on social distancing for a while, but eventually there will be block parties. Eventually there will be concerts in the peristyle, and all of the things that we love about this institution will come to fruition again.
I think that's beautifully said. Certainly, as I've reflected on it, one of the things that I've taken from the research you've done is that this institution has been through something different but similar,
right,
and we will get through it again, that
right.
Humanity is resilient. None of us could have imagined a global pandemic as the backdrop for any new director. Certainly I never imagined it. And even more recently, as we have this conversation, the events of just the past few weeks have roiled all of us, right, further still. And I'm wondering, in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and so many others, what lessons there are for this institution from the 1960s and the experiences that we had during that seminal moment in American history.
Well, I can honestly say that I haven't researched that specifically, but I will, and come back with a better answer for you. However, one thing I would like to bring up in response to that is the formation of something called the Minority Advisory Council, and that was established in 1981 under Roger Mandel. And that was a coming together of specifically Black leaders of the community, and they advised the museum on what kinds of programs and exhibitions and gatherings that we should be having to be more inclusive. And that morphed into, they changed its name into the Committee for Cultural Diversity. And it wasn't just a committee, it was a board level committee. There was a member, the chairperson was a member of our board of trustees.
So in the same way we have volunteer groups like the docents and the ambassadors that had a board seat, there was a committee for cultural diversity. And again, the research that you've done for me on this has been incredibly instructive. For more than 3 decades, the institution had this committee. And certainly as we think about ways to ensure greater equity and inclusion, which means focusing community voices, we have so much to learn by listening and engaging authentically with the community and the entire community. But we also have things to learn from our history and figuring out ways that we can not return to what was done, but reinvent the good intentions of the past, but do it in a way which is more connected to and more sustainably engaged with our entire community.
Exactly.
So incredibly helpful research, Julie. Thank you. So as the archivist who knows everything and anything about this institution, what advice would you give for me as I come in as a new director? What can you glean from the history of the 10 directors prior, which would be a good thing for me to remember?
I don't know how to answer that except to go to each of the directors and to point out the positives of each one of them and to say, here is something you might want to model.
I love that, please.
So let's start with Almond Whiting. He is the often forgotten first director of our building, of our institution. And Almond Whiting was the right person with the right credentials in the right place at the right time. And he was our director from 1901 to 1903. But his philosophy was that an art museum should be for the upper class, for the people who already knew about art. And it didn't work here in Toledo. And so instead of telling you what you should do that is like Almond Whiting, I would say the thing to learn from Almond Whiting is not to do that. But then we bring in George Stevens, and he is the right person with the wrong credentials in the right place and talking to the right people. He was a newspaper man. He had this engaging personality. I remember reading one quote that said he was the best loved person in Toledo. And so he had this unbelievable, charismatic personality that just drew people to him. And the one thing that he did when he came in was that he wanted to welcome children to the museum. And he understood that the children of today are the supporters of tomorrow. If you can get a child to love art, then they will always love art. If you get a child to love music, they will always love music. And so his philosophy wasn't to have children come here to become great artists. It was to come here to love art, which is two different things. Yes, have we had great artists come through our education classes? Yes, we have. That wasn't really the point. The point was to foster a love of art. And so if there's one thing to learn from George Stevens, I would say that this institution is here to have people learn a love for art.
And how long was George Stevens director, just to give a sense of how successful he was?
He was the director from 1903 to 1926 when he died.
It's a pretty impressive tenure.
Pretty impressive tenure. For a person who was a newspaper man and who had no background in art.
Well, you know, I don't know that I've ever shared this with you, Julie, but I do think one of the useful ways for museums to conceive of what they do is as publishers. And I don't think it's that surprising that someone with a newspaper background would be successful in that role. And, you know, another word that you've heard that we're starting to use more internally, which I think George Stevens embodied, was the idea of fun.
Right.
We need to have fun in the museum.
Right.
It needs to be fun for anyone and everyone who engages it. And I think George Stevens understood that in his core. So I want to be sensitive to time. So, you know, we've had 10 directors, but let's sort of spotlight some of the key ones in our institutional history. So tell me a little bit about Blakemore Godwin.
Can I jump back to George Stevens
just
for a moment?
Of course you can. You're the boss. You do it.
So one of the things that you have instituted is office hours, where people can come and talk to you, and you've done it electronically. Well, I want to say that George Stevens did that, but he did it for children. And he had certain periods of time where children could come in and talk to him about whatever they wanted to, whether it was their stamp collection or a problem that they have or whatever. And so I go back to my oral histories, and early in my tenure, I met with a man named Harold Tenney, and he was one of these children.
Oh my gosh.
And he went and he talked to George Stevens about this radio that he made. It was a transistor radio, and he couldn't get it to work. And George Stevens took him over to his house in his garage because he had this one thing, and he took this child over and they got it to work. And I got this straight from an oral history from that child who remembered George Stevens.
So I will be taking no museum visitors to my garage.
That's fine.
However, I think you know, one of the things we do talk a lot about is how to cultivate a sense of belonging.
Exactly.
And what is as impressive about that story as the fact that he opened up his office hours to children from the community was that children came.
Right,
to feel comfortable enough and welcome enough, and to have had the agency to just walk into the director's office is a pretty amazing thing, and I think speaks to the type of atmosphere. You're right, we would do well to remember the successes of George Stevens. So tell me a little bit about Blakemore Godwin.
Okay, so Blakemore Godwin is the director after George Stevens. He started in 1916. He was hired to help George Stevens because of George Stevens' illnesses. But the one thing that I would say that Blakemore Godwin gave to us that you could learn from, to go back to the original question, is the solidification of the education program. So it became a school of design. That started under George Stevens, but it was really made much more professional, much more tight, a good organizational model. So kids came in and, you know, started in this class, then went to this class, and then went to this class. And there were, you know, 60 children in a class. I don't know how the teachers did it in those classrooms even, but I think that's the one key thing about Blakemore Godwin was that, and some of the stellar pieces that came into the collection under Blakemore Godwin.
So George Stevens was sort of the visionary
Yes.
who set the path. Blakemore Godwin was the person who brought it together and
Yes,
created some
tightened
process.
it up. Yes.
Okay. And you know, that sort of tees up you know, the lessons we may be able to learn from Otto Whitman, who in many ways made the Toledo Museum of Art we know today.
Right. So Otto Whitman took the Toledo Museum of Art from a local regional institution to an international one. His connections after World War II with the Office of Strategic Services really enabled him to have the connections in Europe to be able to buy works of art a little bit against the market, and to enable us to get at a decent price for art anyway, some really great masterpieces. And so those connections, not just within the United States but abroad, really put us on the map, much more so than we had to start somewhere, and regionally was the place to start, but he made us international.
And so what would you say my lesson to take from Otto's tenure would be?
The brilliant works of art that he was able to acquire during his tenure, and that sense of international importance.
And would it be fair to say that you know, Otto had this national and international view, but he really imbibed the regional, local focus?
Yes.
I mean, so I think about creating the docent program, creating the ambassador program for outreach, diversifying the collection, and being the first director to add non-Western art to the collection, or to add non-Western, non-Asian art to the collection. You know, he had this sense of community, and he focused the national and international efforts into engaging the community. So he didn't view it as either or, he sort of viewed it as both and. Is that fair?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
He also had really great relationships with the businesses. The leaders of industry here in Toledo were having lunch with Otto Whitman. So those connections with the international companies here in Toledo was also a very effective way of moving things forward. And he was also the first person to start to fundraise. He was the one who understood that the Libby endowments weren't going to be an infinite amount of money, and that the museum would grow bigger than what those endowments could support. And so the fundraising aspect is another place that Otto Whitman really started.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people realize even today that the Libby endowment, which we do not operate, it's operated by a separate trust, provides the museum less than about 10% of our operating budget.
Right.
The vast majority of what supports this institution comes from people who didn't have the last name Libby.
Right.
So, you know, the other thing Otto Whitman did, which would be good to remember, is he hired really great people.
It's
so he already
true.
spoke about Blakemore Godwin coming in and assisting George Stevens before taking over. Otto hired a pretty great guy by the name of Roger Mandel.
Yes, that's true.
So what's the lesson I can learn from Roger Mandel?
So Roger Mandel, we spoke very briefly about the Minority Advisory Group. He is the one who had the vision to start that. He also, so that outreach to different ethnicities and that kind of more welcoming environment came from Roger Mandel. And so that's a very good lesson to kind of take in from him. He also did the center core renovations. So he had a different vision of the building and how it could be used. And that may be something also that you will be faced with a master plan. So, you know, kind of changing the changing the building to fit what is needed now as opposed to what was needed in 1926.
Absolutely. Well, we'll get back to the master plan maybe another conversation. But so to keep going sequentially, because that could have been a moment to jump ahead.
Yes,
of course,
sorry.
Brian Kennedy. But tell me a little bit about David Steadman, who succeeded Roger.
So David Steadman, I actually started under David Steadman, so I knew him. And his legacy is probably expanding the campus. So he bought the Parkview Hospital and was able to increase the amount of land that surrounded and enabled us to have the land to build the glass pavilion. So he was also looking forward towards the centennial. So he kind of laid the groundwork for all of the centennial celebrations. He knew that he was going to be doing something else, but he laid the groundwork for Roger Berkowitz to then step forward and take the reins over and have these wonderful celebrations of this institution.
What a great transition to Roger,
yes.
who, from my first stint here, has been very, very dear to me. He and Rhoda both. There's an expression that you sometimes hear used of people, the soul of the institution. Roger is that person in so many ways for TMA still. So what's the lesson from Roger?
The lesson from Roger is he bought great art and he had an institutional memory and a community memory. He knew everyone in Toledo, it seems like, and everyone knew him. Just recently, my aunt, she asks me, every time she saw me, she would ask me, how's Roger? Because he genuinely liked people and people knew that he just understood people and they loved him as much as he loved them.
A little bit of the George Stevens phenomenon.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
I would put that in there, the charismatic, being able to talk to people and to connect with people. And not only that, he also bought great art and was able to change the institution structure so that it functioned better.
Well, I didn't. Unfortunately, David Steadman passed, and never got a chance to meet him. But Roger Berkowitz and Roger Mandel have always struck me in their tenures in how ahead of the field they were, and their thinking about community and the way they acted about community, the way they synthesized that with a focus on quality, really viewing quality as an inclusive idea. But Roger Berkowitz in particular, I've always been so impressed by his approach to staff as well. He really thought inclusively about employee engagement in ways that were Google-esque before Google existed. So moving on from Roger, he was succeeded by Don Bacigalupi and then ultimately by Brian Kennedy, whom I know well. But what are the lessons I can learn from our more recent directors, Don, Brian, and then of course John Stanley, who has recently been named sort of the 10th director? So
Don Bacigalupi, he built the glass pavilion. So again, that enlarging of the campus. He also introduced different artists, gay and lesbian artists, so a little bit more diversity there into the collection more openly. So that's another thing that you could learn from Don. From Brian, Brian is so new, it feels like he's still here almost. And so Brian, he had all of these different, there was fun here, playtime and video games and sneaker culture, all of these things that brought a different audience to the museum. And once you kind of get them in the door, oh yeah, by the way, here's this wonderful painting. Again, that George Stevens idea of get people to like art, and that's a gift that they will have for the rest of their lives. So
So of course Brian is sort of a great mentor of mine, whom I've known since my days at Dartmouth. Someone recently asked how I would describe Brian, and in many ways he's a little bit like an uncle to me, one of those uncles who isn't related to you. But so I think, sort of to summarize, one of the challenges for me, or maybe I choose to look at the world through the lens of opportunities. One of the opportunities is if you think about even George Stevens' tenure. While he widened the aperture of what the Toledo Museum of Art could be, he still did it within the confines of a hierarchy of art history he inherited from Almond Whiting.
Exactly.
But every director has widened a little bit further. And Brian, even our most recent directors, so Don widening in terms of how we think inclusively about our collection, Brian widening further, but also widening the programmatic nature of our exhibitions, experiential exhibitions, activating this idea of arts instruction and multisensory engagement and marrying it with fine arts. So the opportunity for me is to widen further. Right. Some have chosen to widen through campus expansion. Some have chosen to widen with different collections management priorities and policies or exhibitions policies. So my job, you've laid it out for me, is to keep listening, to keep learning, and to figure out what this community demands, and to synchronize that with important and great works of art. And if we do that together and we listen to the community while doing it, I know that we can build the museum, we can elevate this museum to new heights still.
Perfect.
Thank you, Julie.
You're welcome.